I'm Jono Hall, aka the Multisport Brain, Triathlon Canada head coach. You're listening to the Physical Performance Show today with Brad Beer.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back, or welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by the Gold Coast Marathon and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, physiotherapist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. The aim of this show is to educate and inspire you towards the pursuit of your own physical best performance. We do this through interviews featuring some of the world's top physical performers and also some of the world's preeminent experts in their chosen fields. Each week, we'll aim to bring you the highs, the lows, and the learnings of the featured guests through various episodes, including featured performers, expert editions, coaches corner, and interest editions. And this week, episode 147, I bring you a conversation that I had with head coach of Triathlon Canada, Jono Hall. Not only is Jono a renowned coach in the world of triathlon, however, Jono himself was a top-level athlete, winning the 1997 Australian Road Cycling Championships, going on to ride professionally, being trained out of the Australian Institute of Sport for many years, and also later with the Festina professional road cycling team. Jono went on to finish 8th in the World Cycling Championships and also gained selection for the 1994 Commonwealth Games representing Australia. But it was in the sport of duathlon that Jono really excelled, where in 1997, Jono took the World ITU Duathlon title in convincing fashion. On a coaching front, Jono now works with some of the world's best triathlon competitors. And on today's episode, we talk about the philosophies that underpin Jono Hall's success as head coach for Triathlon Canada. We touch on when to intervene and when not to intervene as a coach, the concept of a 4-day weekly training cycle. Jono shares what he believes constitute good coaching and also his top 3 characteristics of athletes seeking to reach their physical best. We talk about why the fundamentals cannot be neglected for the 1%ers and how Jono builds trust with his athletes. There's so much in this Coach's Corner edition of the Physical Performance Show featuring Jono Hall, head coach Triathlon Canada. Let's jump right in. Well, I've been looking forward to catching up with today's featured coach. This is a coach edition and the Coach's Corner, and that is none other than Jono Hall. And Jono, as per the bio, your history is very rich in sport from your own performance and now your head coach role for Triathlon Canada in your own private group. So welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thanks, Brad. It's fantastic to be on the line with you here today. So it's an honour, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit of my background, my knowledge, where I see some of the things that are going in the sport, and conversing with you about that.
Jono, a question I always ask to start our time together is, what's one thing that you're learning at the moment?
I'm really learning about systems. I guess I come from obviously an athletic background into a coaching background, but it's been quite a drawn-out process finishing my MBA. And one of the things I'm really into systems and looking at applying systems to what I do in coaching, or particularly what I do in coaching, what I do with national federations. And so it's kind of something I'm currently really delving into. I've had a little bit of time off and a little bit of vacation, and I like to keep myself active. And I've been kind of studying the different ways or the possibilities to apply, I guess, a systems way of thinking to what I do as a coach and what I do as a national federation. So it's a little bit dry. It's not super exciting stuff. However, if I can find a way to apply it to what I'm doing, then obviously the aim of that is to enhance the performance of my athletes and the national program I work with, then it'd be quite exciting.
Any practical examples of how you are applying these systems to your coaching?
Just looking at that systems approach is about inputs and outputs, and making sure that everything we put into the program actually creates the output we're after. So it's not a high level thing in coaching with what I'm doing yet. It's looking at the fundamentals, but it is quite a test when you start applying those kind of theories to what you're doing, and all of a sudden you find that there's things that you're doing that you're inputting into your programming that actually don't have an output or don't have the output you're after. And so I guess it's just a critical way of analysing the way you go about things. I mean, and in this case, the way I've been going about things. And so far I've been able to find that, there's a few things that I've been putting in as inputs into my coaching and my structures and my systems that maybe aren't producing the outcomes that I was hoping for. So I'm trying to identify, how I can enhance that and potentially change that. And there's a few that I'll probably get rid of that taking that helicopter view and standing back is going, well, they probably weren't the right things to be inputting. And it's no surprise that there wasn't an output. And then just looking at how things recycle back in. So looking at athlete feedback and how that feeds back into the system of how I coach and how I interpret data and et cetera, et cetera. So it's something I find quite interesting in the sense that it's, I guess, not a traditional coaching tool, but it's one that I've studied with my business studies, and it's kind of obvious there. So I'm kind of playing around with it, saying, okay, well, if something that's successful outside of sport, can I apply it to sport and make what I'm doing in sport that little bit better? Yeah,
terrific. And the athletes, are they aware of you tinkering with systems?
No, they're always aware that I'm tinkering. They're very aware that a lot of the study and a lot of the work I do for my own education, which it ultimately is to help them, isn't necessarily steeped in a traditional sporting background. So a lot of the mentors I've used over the years, a lot of the reading that I do, a lot of the areas I look aren't always in the sporting books or looking at other coaches. They're looking at other best practices, for want of a better term, or other people who are turning things around dramatically in the business world or in the technology world or something like that, and saying, okay, are there some shortcuts there, or are there some things there that we can apply to sport that that'll make my coaching better and then subsequently help the performance of my athletes?
Now, I find even in my work as a physiotherapist, but when you can look outside your own industry and harvest ideas and thoughts around, it's easy to get very insular in the way things have always been done. So would you agree that there's a lot of richness in bringing things externally out of the normal environments that we all come to appreciate and get used to?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a richness in always looking beyond the obvious. I think it's kind of easy to look at the obvious and get stuck into the things that are obviously in front of you and around you, but I think it does no harm to look beyond that. And there is a risk that comes with that. I think when you start to kind of get out there into the things that maybe make 2%, 3% different, not 10% different, then you run the risk that it doesn't make a difference. But I think with the time I've spent coaching and with the athlete group I've got, I think I allow myself the luxury, and the athletes permit me to do so, and so they don't see it as a distraction. I'm sure I come out with some pretty different ideas for them that make them roll their eyes, or they kind of question what's that, how's that relevant to what they're doing, particularly for their athletics career. But we've also formed a degree of trust whereby they know that if I bring something new to the table, it's not something that I read in the newspaper that morning. It's something I've been looking at over a period of time, and I've kind of got to the stage where I'm comfortable that it's probably going to add value, and the possibility that it doesn't is very low. So again, and that's a system in itself, that trust with the athletes and that interaction with my athletes is that you can kind of operate in that realm.
I've noted that down, building trust with athletes, so I'd like to circle back to that, Jono. But let's go backwards to then come back to that with your own sporting life. So well credentialed, Jono. I was a junior triathlete when I remember seeing you popping up on national magazines and winning duathlon titles, and I believe you won the Australian road cycling title there in 1997 and rode professionally with Festina, duathlon world champ. Can you summarise how you got started in this world of sports and your own athletic accomplishments?
Yeah, it's actually really simple. And it's actually an interesting topic because of just a couple of things that happened in Canada recently. But and I'll get into that. But my father was a cyclist, and he wasn't competing when we were younger, but we were aware. We had racing bikes at home, and there was these super lightweight bikes, and there was this, lycra, or at that stage wool jerseys and stuff that were hanging around. So we had this interest in sport. But my parents took my brother and I to the 1982 Commonwealth Games in Brisbane. And it's interesting, I was only thinking about this the other day, I would hate to think what it cost them as a percentage of what their income was to go to a major games. And they're obviously sporting fans. They wanted to support Commonwealth Games in Australia. They wanted to introduce my brother and I to an event like that. And that was, when I look back and, you talk about critical moments, that was probably the week or the 10 days in Brisbane that made me realise that I wanted to be involved in sport. And I was only 10 years old, so obviously at that stage I didn't really know what that would entail. All I was doing at the time was running, cross country at school, as I think most people in Australia do. I was playing a bit of soccer, but that was kind of the start of what I would say my sporting ambitions and my love for sport. And so seeing those high-level athletes face-to-face, doing the typical thing you do when you're 10 years old, running around getting autographs and watching events and I ran next to De Castella in the last kilometre of his marathon win, and some people saw that on live TV. And, there were things that really impacted me and started to drive not only myself but my family. And so from that stage, as a family, we competed in a lot of running events. We spent weekends away. And then somewhere along the line, and I don't know where, I think success, when you're successful at what you do, it kind of, the steps follow quite clearly. But I was running well at school. I was kind of winning my high school cross-country events. I was going on to represent, my region, my state at national championships, et cetera, et cetera. And then I fell into the running piece. But what kind of was interesting was they got to a stage there where I had this curiosity on the bike. And that came with a series that was developed in Sydney or in New South Wales in the probably mid to late 80s called the Ride and Stride, which was basically the start of the duathlon scene. And I got into these duathlon events because my father was running, he'd ridden the bike, and I was running, and we decided that, I'd give it a go. And so I got into multisport then in duathlon. And my first duathlon, I think, was 1985. My first triathlon, I think, Nepean was 1986, 87. I'd have to go back and have a look. And then that's where I found myself in the multisport kind of realm. I was only very small, very late developer. I fell in love with the bike much more than running. That was one thing that was really obvious. And I wasn't very good on the bike. Like I said, I was probably racing. I was racing at that stage. It was juveniles and juniors, and I was racing young men, and I was certainly a boy. But as I matured and gained strength on the bike is kind of what took over what I was doing, and so I kind of. Only by the age then of 18, I'd been a runner, and I'd done a lot of running events, a lot of fun runs. Had success for that age. I've been into duathlon, but then I got into cycling and found my way by 91, 92, 93, 94 in the Australian national cycling team. That was an interesting ride. I mean, I spent my time at the AIS in Canberra. We lived on residence, and it's a time that a lot of people kind of asked me what that was like, and I'll be honest, I mean, I'm quite sad with the demise of the AIS program because I lived there, and I thought, even though, it used the word institute, and we were kind of institutionalised from my perspective, it was the most productive training environment, high-performance environment with multi-sports that I've ever been involved in, and the time I spent there was fantastic. I did the European scene with the national team. Obviously, racing national team was about making the Olympics or about turning professional. I went to Com Games in 94 as a cyclist. At the last minute, I was left off the team and I was made reserve. And it was probably one of the toughest experiences I've been through, to be in an event and not race. And I was quite ashamed at the time, even though it wasn't my fault. It was something that I found very difficult to deal with. And in 94, when I came home from, which is actually Victoria, Canada, I decided that I was done with cycling, and I would go back to university, and I would probably give myself a chance at this multi-sport stuff again. And it's interesting because when you look at how things panned out over time and where I am now, my first duathlon coming back in '94, I raced against Simon Whitfield, and he was in high school, and he was in boarding school in Sydney, obviously as a Canadian, and we did this duathlon. I think it was called the Wombat Duathlon, and it actually ran across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and you had to go up the steps to get there. And I think Simon walloped me in the first run. I gave him a hiding on the bike, and then he caught me running down the stairs in the last run, and that was kind of my foray back into duathlon. And I think at that stage, it's interesting when I look back. By that stage, I felt old. I felt like I'd spent 4 years in a national program. I'd been to Europe. I'd been to a Comm Games. It was time to look at other things, and I decided that I would still pursue multisport, but I would finish my university or start my university and get something else behind me. And then the duathlon really took off for me. I mean, I remember travelling to Melbourne, and I just didn't know. I knew that I'd been at national level, international level on the bike. I knew that I had been able to run, and I knew what I was running, but I didn't know how I'd compete. And I remember flying myself down to Melbourne, and there was an event down there and the Melbourne scene was the duathlon scene at the time, and competing against the David Meads and there was a few guys down there who I'd done my research. They were the guys who were racing well at national level, and I thought, right, best way to find out if I'm any good at this is to go down there, race them, and come home, and at least I'll know what I need to do. And I went down and raced them. I won the race, and then I found myself headlong into duathlon, which is something I was really happy with, because at the end of the day, duathlon, I would have said, was semi-professional. It wasn't really there wasn't really the ability to earn income to be full-time, which suited my needs at the time, because I wanted to study as well. And then I spent my time through that duathlon and started travelling again. And then it kind of culminated, I think, in '95 I realised that I probably had the potential to win a world championship. But as you know, there's a lot of athletes line up with the potential to do so, and only one athlete a year comes home with the ability. And so I had a couple of missed cracks at it. In '95, I raced in Cancun, and that was my first elite world championship. And I went in there pretty confident that I could win the event. I'd raced 2 weeks before, and I'd absolutely destroyed Simon Lessing in a duathlon in Irvine, California. And I thought, right, that's a pretty good sign. This guy's one of the best triathletes in the world. But in the end, in Cancun, the conditions went against me, and I didn't win. And it's interesting because Lessing went on to win the triathlon the week after, so I knew I'd been in good form. I went back in '96, and then it kind of became a bit of a game. I was like, okay, I can win one of these things, but I've got to put it together. And I went back in '96. Which was the first year they'd introduced drafting to duathlon, which for me at the time was a big hindrance, because it really nullified my ability on the bike. And I got run down, I think it was 500 metres to go. Luckily I got run down by a couple of Aussies, so it wasn't so bad at the time. And then I went back the next year, and I raced on a course that I knew was a bike rider's course, a really tough one-loop course. And I just had a day where everything fell into place. I was able to pace myself in the run. I didn't lose a lot of time, but I'd kind of raced strategically, so I'd given a bit of time. I got onto the bike. I caught everyone. I caught them at the bottom of quite a long climb. And then there was a couple of things that fell in my favour. I basically, being a draft legal race, I rode away from the front group. Well, the front group was forming, so I rode away. And there was a little bit of out of sight, out of mind. And so I remember riding the entire 40 Ks or the 35 Ks that remained, thinking that these guys were 30 to 40 seconds behind me, because I couldn't see them. And I think they raced the whole race thinking I was probably 30 to 40 seconds up the road and around the next corner. And it wasn't until I got to transition and I'd ridden as hard as I could that a guy in Spanish kind of said, "Oh, you have 4.5 minutes." And I was like, wow, I'm actually going to win this. And so it's an interesting thing, because there's been a couple of instances in my career where I've won by good margins, and the simple reason I've done that is because I was racing with a lot of fear. I didn't have time checks, and I'm a self-doubter, and so belting along the road thinking they can't be far behind, and not having those time checks were the things that actually made me ride harder. And so that was that with the duathlon. While I was living in Spain, I'd committed I was given free accommodation, which for an athlete is like the holy grail. So whenever someone throws the word free at you when you're a 25-year-old battling duathlete, you basically jump at whatever there is. So I'd moved to Spain before that race, and there weren't many duathlons, so I got back into racing the bike. And then I found myself racing the bike at a high level. There's a few things that happened before that. I'd gained automatic selection for world champs by winning an Oceania time trial championship on the bike in the meantime while I was kind of retired, and got myself a start in the world champs. I had a great world championships. I finished 8th with the pros. And then people started to get in my ear that I could be a professional cyclist, that there was potentially the option that I was good enough. And I bought into that and I said, right, I'm going to put the duathlon. I've won a world title in duathlon. I want to be an Olympian. There's no chance of me being an Olympian as a triathlete. There's no duathlon Olympic event. The only way I could be an Olympian, and given that, this is in the lead up to 2000, is to get back on the bike. And that was the sole reason I got back into bike racing. And I was good enough to get my foot in the door and race with the pros, but I wasn't good enough within that pro environment. I think one of the things that, I didn't underestimate, but I think those who kind of pursued me was that whilst I was a good time trialist, whilst I was very good on my own, I wasn't super in the bunch, or certainly wasn't. I had enough years away from the bike that I'd lost some of the skills and the nuance around racing in the bunch and racing road races. And I don't really regret that period of time racing the bike. Once I realised that I wasn't going to make an Olympic dream, I got myself out of professional bike riding pretty quick, and then went back to duathlon for a period of time. And at that stage, we're talking right up to the year 2000 now. By that stage, I started to work out that I needed to have a plan about finishing my own athletic career, and that maybe coaching would be one of the potential pathways, having been an athlete and having taken a great deal of interest in what went on around me as an athlete, and whether I could use that into coaching. So it's a very long-winded answer, but it kind of paints the picture of where I've been. And there's a lot of stuff that's glossed over there, obviously. One of the things I've gone out of my way to do, and people often ask me why, is if you go to my LinkedIn profile, and I see my LinkedIn profile as my professional profile, and professionally I'm a coach. I don't have anything about my sporting background there, and people often ask why. And I think I've worked really hard since retiring as an athlete to kind of put that part of life behind me. It's certainly something that I draw upon, but it's not something athletes want to hear about. They don't want to hear about the, I, when I did this and when I did that and I used to do this way and I would, And so I've tried to really separate my coaching from my past athletic career and let my coaching speak for itself, so people don't come to me because I was a duathlon world champion, I was a professional cyclist. They want to work with me because they've worked out that I've got some coaching skills that can help them become better. And it's quite an interesting process. Even a lot of the young athletes, it will be 2 years and all of a sudden they'll, through Google, they go, oh, you actually raced. Yeah. And I'll laugh. I say, yeah, as hard as it is to believe, yes, I did used to race, and yes, I was okay. And so it gives me a background of experience for some of the knowledge that I pass on, but I certainly don't use it as a big driving force in what I do coaching-wise.
No, look, thanks for going there, because there's layers upon layers, and as you say, that was a quick gloss over, but really you've competed at elite level across essentially 3 sports. Triathlon there for a period, duathlon and cycling, and obviously your expertise as a junior runner. Jono, shifting gears over to your world of coaching, I believe your first professional appointment was with Triathlon Australia. You then spent time with USA Triathlon as, I believe, the high performance director for a period of time before your current role, which is the head coach at Triathlon Canada, plus your own small private group. So that's an interesting journey. Can you paint the picture for us of what your typical week looks like? What does Jono Hall's typical week look like in the head coach role for Triathlon Canada?
Well, the typical week, I like to spend as many sessions with my athletes as I need to. And so I think as you go through your development as a coach, you start to work out that you need to be at key sessions and you need to stay away, or my belief is you need to stay away from over-coaching. And I think it sends a real clear message to my athletes. So I'm at all the sessions where I can make a difference as a coach, and I stay away from the sessions that are basically, general conditioning, that there's not a lot of teaching or not a lot of feedback needed, because I think you can go both ways. You can obviously be under-present and not be there enough, or you can be over-present and overbearing. And so my athletes work out that if I'm at a session, that it's a session where they're going to be taught something and they're going to, ideally they're going to learn something, or I'm going to challenge them on something. But they also know that if I'm not at a session, that it's a pretty, what I would call a bread and butter session, and that might be a 2.5 hour endurance ride. You don't need the coach with you for that 2.5 hours when there's no real coaching going on. And so, I probably spend 3 hours a day. I critique myself very heavily. I kind of always say to people, there's no one critiques me harder than I do. And I also have this fear of failure. And so it can be a little bit cumbersome at times, but I probably spend 3 hours a day checking over the programming I've planned for that day and making sure that on what I'm looking at from the previous days, the previous cycle, what I'd planned to do is still relevant. And for me, that's the big piece of coaching, is that intervention piece, that ability to either intervene and change something or not intervene and leave it as you planned. But I like every day to test that, is what we planned to do today still the right thing given what we did yesterday, or given even what the athletes did the night before? Did they sleep well? Did they wake up, early? Did they not eat right? Was their appetite off? I take all those things into the mix before every session. And so a lot of my days spent around that analysis. And then obviously the rest of the time is spent around the delivery. So at the sessions, I try to create, I guess it's almost like a teaching approach, an education approach with, a lesson plan. We've got clear outcomes that we want to achieve from a session, and then I work towards delivering the teaching or the coaching within the session to make sure we get to that outcome. And that leads also as an interesting process that I think what I've observed is a little bit different to other coaches, is that if we're swimming and I have a session planned, and the session plan has, the detail, the distance, the breakdown, what we're trying to do, but the most important thing in that session plan is what we are trying to achieve. If I achieve something in a session and we achieve that before the session was due to finish, I'll finish the session. I won't do work or workouts for the sake of making up numbers or sticking to something. And obviously, inversely, if something takes the full session, then I'll stick with it. What we don't tend to do is we don't tend to, keep flogging a dead horse. If we've got an outcome and it's clear that session isn't achieving that outcome for whatever reason, sometimes we'll stop the session within 5 minutes and I'll just say, look, what we're trying to achieve today isn't going to happen. Let's not waste our time and, just swim up and down the pool or whatever it is we're doing. Let's write that session off, work out why so that we don't find ourselves in that situation again. And I think there's a shared responsibility with that between myself. Have I got it wrong, or is there something that the athlete got wrong or didn't get right, so to say? So, they're 10-hour days, 10 to 12-hour days. I do get a break within those days, and I try to use that just to decompress and free my mind and make sure that I'm not caught up in the detail. But I would honestly say I spend between 10 to 12 hours every day involved in my coaching, looking at it, delivering it, planning it, reviewing it, researching other stuff. And I'll be honest, but those days fly by and I love it. I wouldn't have it any different. And obviously no different to the athletes. They get their intense blocks of work and I get my intense blocks of work, and then we all get these down periods where we can obviously refresh and regenerate. But I'm one of these people, when it's moving quickly, when it's challenging, when there's lots of athletes, when there's lots of work, I find that's when I'm in my element. That's when I'm coaching best. So, we coach. I don't run a calendar week cycle. We run 4-day blocks, which again is a little bit different for the athletes. But I don't believe our bodies recognise a traditional calendar week. And so I work very hard on that and how to integrate that. And that can be a little bit more difficult as well because, a lot of people get down to, Sunday's your long run, whereas our long run might be on day 3. So that on week 1, that could be Wednesday. On week 2, that could be, Thursday. On week 3, that could be whatever. And juggling, obviously, the athletes' personal lives and working with North American athletes. Church is a big thing on Sundays that you've got to factor in, which is a little bit different. But yeah, there's a lot of work there, I guess, is what I'm trying to paint the picture of. And it's one of the things I pride myself on. I've always said, I think I'm a pretty good coach. I'm not sure, but one thing I know I do well is I put absolutely all the time necessary into it. And I think that also makes me a good coach.
Oh, there's so much there. Jono, that's great, though, to give a bit of the delineation, a bit of an insight into your week, but, delineating between analysis and delivery, I think that's quite a neat distinction. And what you just said at the end intrigues me around you're not sure if you're a good coach or not. how does a coach measure their validity in terms of what they're doing? I mean, obviously, everyone points to performance, podiums, etc., and all programs are structured around that, funded around that, etc. But, you know, as you reflect and as you say, that's a habit that you've built into your week and days, you know, what does good coaching mean to Jono Hall?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I have my own personal views, and I think they're important because I think that it's very easy just to go straight to the obvious. You know, a good coach produces Olympic medals, and I would dispute that. I would say a great athlete produces Olympic medals. A good coach makes sure that athlete gets there, and I think the coaching, what goes back to the coach, should probably more represent the relationship. And like I said, at the end of the day, I've been very fortunate. I've had fantastic athletes who make me look very good. In saying that, there's a lot of fantastic athletes that don't make it to reach their potential. And so I think one of the things, and it's hard to measure, but one of the things that I think do well is I actually get athletes to reach their potential. I get them to reach their potential more often, and I get them to reach their potential at the very big events. And so there's this whole conundrum when you're coaching and when you're an athlete, especially in the world of triathlon. We've got this World Series, which is a world championship now, but it's based on a series of races. So it rewards excellence, but it rewards consistency. And then once every 4 years, we have the big dance, the Olympics, which is only about one day. And I mean, if you went through a 4-year cycle and you never won a World Series race, but you won the Olympic Games, you could probably argue that that's the pinnacle. And there's a lot of people go through the 4 years and they're very good in the series, but don't get it right on the big day. And I think one of the things that I think I've managed to do well is the athletes that I do have is when those big days come around, I have them at their absolute physical and mental best. And whether that's good coaching or not, I guess depends on the way you look at it. And I think there's another couple of metrics I look at, which are pretty simple. You know, people will say to, you know, people ask me that question, you know, do you think you're a good coach, or why do you think you're a good coach? And generally I say I don't know, but I keep getting job offers. So I'm obviously employable. There's people who are looking for coaching, who are looking at what I do and think this guy must be okay because they're offering me a job. And then the big thing is, I mean, it's basic consumerism. The athletes keep coming back, and there's athletes who pay for my services. And that's always a test when you work for a national federation, because for those of you who are listening, you kind of don't know the intricate details. Like if I work for a national federation for Triathlon Canada, those Canadian athletes don't pay me for my coaching services. I'm employed by Triathlon Canada to provide coaching services to those athletes. But my international athletes pay me to coach. So they have an option. They can opt out. And my coaching fees are probably at the top end of what people are asking. And that's based on, I think, the amount of work I put into it and what I think is the return. I think most of the athletes who engage me look at it and go, well, okay, that's a lump of money over 12 months. But I think generally at the end of 12 months, they're like, wow, that was a great investment, because that money has, you know, given me the ability to perform at these other events and make money. But it's also a good metric. When people stop ringing and people stop asking, or people don't want to come back to your program, then you know pretty well that you're not on the mark. And when people keep coming back and you've got, you know, people wanting to come in, then for me that's a good measure that I must be doing a good job as a coach and I'm okay as a coach. I think the piece about not being sure and the workload piece is I see people, and I've worked with people who I think are a lot smarter than me, have at times even a bigger impact on athletes than I do, but they're not willing to put in the time. And so I'm not downplaying myself, but one of the things I've worked out is no different to, you know, you hear it all the time, the best athletes are the most talented with the best work ethic. You can be the most talented with no work ethic and you'll get so far. If you've got no talent and work ethic, you'll get so far. And if you're not talented, you know, but as a coach, I think that's the piece thing. I think I've got some coaching ability, but I back it with a heck of a lot of work. And so, like I said, I think there's results that point towards the fact that I must be doing a good job. I've been employed now for 15 years as a coach professionally by national federations. That's a pretty good sign. People keep coming back and people are interested and wanting to join the group. That's a pretty good sign. But at the end of the day, I mean, I work for the athletes, and so my my view on what I do is kind of secondary to kind of where I get them to.
Yeah, so Jono, reaching potential, getting it right on the big day, and then for yourself personally, you commented before with your own performance as an athlete that you're always a self-doubter, and looking from the outside in, I'd say that's a healthy thing that's driven you to continually evaluate your coaching and never really settle. And that humility, I think, is always a good sign of someone that knows that there's always more.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I would like to think I'm humble. It was interesting. I had a great conversation with a very dear friend when on the Gold Coast at the recent World Championships, and we were talking, and she said, she said, "What do you think is the difference between confidence and arrogance?" And I said, "Oh, that's a good one." I said, because and I think she was alluding to the fact that she'd probably been labelled both, and I know that at times I've been labelled both, and I said, well, confidence is knowing that you're good at what you do. Arrogance is continually reminding people. And so I like to think the humility piece is, I'm comfortable with what I do. Like I said, I set higher standards than anyone could ever set for me. So those standards, but I don't feel the need that I need to, ram it in people's faces or anything like that, or go out of my way to point things out. And I think the athletes appreciate that. I think a coach, is my perspective, I think the coach, and it's the opposite. It should be, heard and not seen. That I'm the voice behind things, but when people pan around, the focus is on the athlete. And I'm quite happy to be if I have an athlete who wins a race, I'm quite happy to be the first one back at the hotel and the athlete's getting all the accolades. And I work my way very clearly to make sure that all the focus remains on the athletes and their abilities and what they've achieved, and it's not really deflected to me in any way as a coach.
You're listening to Jono Hall, head coach of Triathlon Canada, sharing key insights from both his coaching career and also his professional cycling and duathlon sporting career. Support for today's show comes from the Gold Coast Marathon. Just like the Physical Performance Show, the Gold Coast Marathon encourages runners of all ages and abilities to push their boundaries and strive to complete a personal challenge. The Gold Coast Marathon is held annually on the first weekend in July and is a must-do event for any budding athlete, weekend warrior, or family looking for a challenge to complete together. Run for the good times at the Gold Coast Marathon. Visit goldcoastmarathon.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. In addition to traditional session-to-session pay-as-you-go appointments, we offer some industry-first fixed-fee services, including the very popular monthly Wellness Booster packs, where from a low $195 health fund rebatable, you can receive hands-on physiotherapy, active rehabilitation, including clinical Pilates and exercise physiology, remedial massage therapy, and access to state-of-the-art rehabilitation equipment such as the anti-gravity Alter-G treadmill. For more information about Pogo Physio's services or to schedule your 1-hour initial appointment, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back with Triathlon Canada's head coach, Jono Hall, on this, a Coach's Corner edition. Jono, in terms of the analysis, you broke down your role as analysis and delivery. What are the, in brief, what are some of the key data items that you like to use in this current world of endless amounts of data? What do you think matters and what doesn't?
That's a really good question. I like to collect as much data as I can, and just for the simple reason that it's become so easy. And so putting some sort of tracking device, whether it's GPS that uses a whole heap of heart rate and a whole heap of metrics, or whether it's a power monitor, or whether it's taking laps on the pool, I like it. It's so easy to collect all of that. I just collect all of it. I think one of the big things is that, interviewing, Jono Hall as a coach, you're really interviewing something that's much bigger than an individual. I do have, and it's not a plug, I do kind of operate under this name, the multisport brain. And the multisport brain was something that the name I developed in 2003 with the aim of acknowledging and probably developing the fact that it takes more than one person and it takes more than one tool. And so with the analysis piece, I use Training Peaks as an analysis tool. I also use it as the platform that we prescribe exercise on. I mean, it can be a training journal, it can be a training diary, but there's a back end that does a lot of analysis, which really is plug and play. And so if you kind of have a fundamental knowledge on how that works and how the WKO platform works, which is an extension of the Training Peaks analysis platform, then it can give you summaries whenever you want. So whenever an athlete updates something, it will pump out a summary of what I'm after. So I'm not looking at all the data, but it has used all the data to give me those pointers. I don't use it as the black and white, this is what we stick to. It's a guide. I'm a very visual person, and so all of the graphs and all of the things that it spits out to me are visual. And I'm looking for what I call one of the fundamentals of exercise prescription, which is just progressive overload. So I'm looking at stressing the athletes and loading the athletes and then deloading them and getting them to adapt, assimilate the training, reloading. So I'm looking for this shape in what I do, graphically from these analysis tools. And I'll be honest, the big thing that stands, I wouldn't say behind me because that would be unfair, around me, is I'm surrounded myself with some very, very smart people, and probably people who are a lot smarter than I am. Not necessarily across swim, bike and run as a triathlon coach, but they're very knowledgeable on their physiology. They're very knowledgeable on their biomechanics. They're very knowledgeable on their running, their swimming, their cycling, their sports psych. I play this role where I'm almost like the conductor of an orchestra. I get all these brilliant individuals who are available to me either through my national federation or I engage them privately. And this is one of the advantages of working across multiple federations. I get all of those people to assist me in my analysis. And so, if I'm honest, which I am, I'm the person who stands at the top and filters all that expertise and all that data and all that knowledge, and then decides, are we swimming 2K tomorrow or 3K? And it comes out as, like, when you do it like that, it's quite simple. But what I make sure is that the rationale behind that and what goes into making that decision on the science side is then matched by the art side. So the science, or what I'm looking at from some numbers and the scientific side, is then matched by how the athlete feels. And I think that's where what I do really well is I think I do really well on that human component of whether it's intuition, but having, and I think this is where being an athlete comes into play. The athletes will turn up and they'll be like, oh, I've got really sore legs today. And I'll be like, yeah, I know. Oh, how do you know? Well, I gave you those sore legs. I wrote the exercise to get you there. Like, I expect you to be there, and that's where I know you are. And having been an athlete, I actually know how that feels. So the athlete isn't looking at me kind of going, yeah, right, coach, like, you've got no idea what this feels like. I think they look at me and go, well, this guy probably does. All of those things go into the mix then to help me create the program and adjust the program. I'm notorious, and I have a very bad reputation amongst my athletes, and I know they hate it, that I tend to provide their programming quite late. And so, like, it might be the night before that I will go into the detail of what they're doing the next day. And the simple reason I do that is because I want to make sure that before I concrete what we're doing the next day, that what I plan to do still makes sense based on what we just have done. And one of my endeavours and one of my promises to the athletes is that I will be better at that coming into the end of 2018, 2019. But it's driven by that. It's driven by that need or that desire to make sure that I don't make any mistakes with what the athletes are doing. I don't miss anything. I don't gloss anything over. I want to make my decisions on the most current information. And then when you look at how that's applied in other areas of sport, it's no different to, the stock exchange or other things where, you wouldn't be saying, well, I got, information on that share 2 days ago and I plan to do this. You'd be looking at what was happening probably until the 5 minutes before you to make some sort of transaction of that nature. And so that kind of paints a picture into, where I get the data, how I use the data, who uses the data and all the inputs that go into play. And I think that will also give you a picture why, for me, for others, they see my process as a little bit cumbersome because it is quite labour intensive. But for me, when I'm dealing with athletes who have entrusted their sporting careers and aspirations in my hands, then it's got to be the gold level service, nothing else.
Yeah, art and science. Jono, what would you say? This is a very difficult question, but are the top 3 characteristics of peak performers? If you had to nail it down to 3 things, top 3.
Top 3. To achieve a peak level performance?
Yeah, what do you observe through all your years competing at an elite level and now your years coaching, many years of coaching? If you had to boil it down, what do you think are the top 3 characteristics that allow people to reach their best?
Well, I'm going to take the training piece out of it because I'm going to make the presumption that the training's taken care of itself. But if you're looking for any athlete to be successful on race day, you've got to be healthy. That for me, and it's such an underrated piece of the equation because people go, yeah, well, of course they're healthy. No, there's a lot of athletes start races that aren't healthy. You've got to have belief, and you've got to have a plan. And if you've had the right training plan behind you and you can bring those things together on race day, then you're more than likely going to reach your potential. I mean, because your potential's been dictated in the lead up to that event. But there's lots of athletes who have these amazing build-ups and it looks like they're going to do something, but on race day they lose their belief, they don't have a plan, or they're not at optimal health. And so I think one of the things that I really focus on as a coach, and I kind of harp on, is that, if people would ask me, what do I do well? I think we do the fundamentals really, really well, because I think there's a lot of people get caught in, doing the 1%ers and the game changers and this and that, and they're all fine. But if you don't do the fundamentals right, then you're probably not even going to get to exercise those 1%ers or those bits that are right out there on the end of the scale that may make a difference and may not make a difference. And I think that's a really important philosophy. If you were to profile my athletes and say, okay, what athletes who have worked with me or worked with my group, what are the things that stand out? They're all very, very good at the fundamentals. And we saw that in Super League on the technical courses. Like, I see bike skills as a fundamental. It's not a 1%er. And so when we get thrown an incredibly technical course, my athletes all stand out. And some of them stand out despite not necessarily having the same physical characteristics or abilities of some of the athletes who are next to them. And so, like I said, they're the kind of those 3 things: health, belief, and a plan are key to achieving high performance. But like I said, or that high performance in a day, they for me fall into that category of nailing the fundamentals. And like I said, I'm lucky. I've obviously got very talented athletes, and so it's easy for me to say. But even with that talent, we continually go back to, have we nailed the fundamentals? Can we nail the fundamentals? And if we can, and we've nailed them with good health, belief in their abilities, and a good race day plan, then they tend to finish at the pointy end of the program. And I think that's one of the biggest messages that'll probably come later when you ask me some questions, just about one of the lessons I've learnt about what does it take to race well on race day. And I've always said, you can race well undertrained, but you can't race well injured. And so when people are making decisions, do I do that one last session, or I'm a little bit tight, but this last session's on the program, I'll say, you know what, cut the session, go in healthy, as opposed to, because if you do the session and you have a killer session but you're injured when you start the race, you've got no hope of performing at your best ability. And it always baffles me why athletes turn up on the start line carrying an injury or sick, because at the end of the day, there's very little chance they're going to reach their potential on that day.
Yeah, it's so important. Jono, building trust with athletes, what do you believe are the irrefutable keys to building trust with athletes?
I think the keys are the interaction. I think the keys are you deliver what you say you're going to do. I think the keys are you over-deliver, you under-promise and over-deliver. I think one of the keys and trusting athletes is multifaceted. They need to trust that the training you're giving them is going to make them better, and that's not a complicated one to solve, because at the end of the day, once you start working with an athlete and you give them work and they start getting better, they're hooked. I mean, and rightly so, I think, because at the end of the day, it's one of the fundamental things they engage you for. the relationship piece where they know that when they're going well, you're out of sight. So like if they're going really well, you're at the back and you're out of sight of everyone else. And when they're not going well, you're actually at the front, making sure that you're deflecting whatever it is from them. And that might be, at the highest level, that might be deflecting criticism from the press around why, someone didn't race to their potential at a major games. And so where you position yourself with the athlete and that the athlete realises that you've always got their back, and having their back means that when they do well, they get 100% of their success. You don't steal any of their success or any of their fanfare. And when they're not doing well, you actually also, as a coach, stand up and take your share of responsibility. And again, I think that's what differentiates some of the things I do to some of the other coaches is that you see athletes doing well, and then all of a sudden the coach is present and they're there. And when you see the athlete not doing well, the coach is nowhere to be seen. And I've always flipped that around. And again, that probably comes back through my athletic experience on who I respected and who I bonded with and why, was that, this joint responsibility. And I think that's the big thing. I think the athletes know that I give everything I have to help them achieve their goals, but at no stage are they my goals or my outcomes. And I'll tell you a little funny story that it was probably a bit cheeky at the time, but I remember starting with my first gig with Triathlon Australia, I think it was 2003, and they basically engaged me because I got to know a few people, I was training with a few people, and I asked questions like, how come you guys don't do this? And what if you did this? And what if you did that? And I think there was an element where they said, well, why don't you come and deliver it if you know so much? And so I said, okay. But I came to this conference and I had a coach, and I won't say the coach's name, but I had a coach present about his coaching pathway. And at that stage, I wasn't really sure whether I was going to coach. So I was very intrigued on why people coach. And this coach said, I decided I wanted to be an Olympian. And I remember standing up and trying to bite my tongue. And I felt like saying, what, you started swimming again? And he said, no, I was a coach. And I said, and this was me as probably being the ex-athlete. I was like, you can't be an Olympian. You can be an Olympic coach. But for me, the days of being an Olympian happen when you're an athlete. And so I've been to 4 Olympic Games. I've been on official teams. There's people refer to me, oh, you're an Olympian, and I'm very clear that no, I'm not. I'm an Olympic coach. The athlete is the Olympian. And I think from my experience, the athletes respect and then it gains trust that you know where you stand, you know what your role is, you know what you have to do, you go about doing it, but it's always about them. It's only about them. And, there's this, catchphrase, athlete-centered, coach-driven. But I think that's a really good analogy of why athletes stick with certain coaches, because they realise that the coach will drive the process, the coach will provide everything they can to make the athlete better, the coach will look after them, look after their physical health, look after their mental health, will push them to the point where they can be pushed but not beyond, will find solutions for them, but then the coach is never the centre of attention. And I think for me that's something that has helped me earn the trust of my current athletes, and I think it helps me earn the trust of some of their peers as well. I know when I'm at Super League, I have a great relationship with a lot of athletes. I don't coach any of them. I never will coach any of them. They probably, but I think I've gained that, even that trust with them that here's a guy who's here supporting his athletes, and he can't be too bad because he's not the centre of attention. He's taking his own time to come and support them. He's certainly behind them. They're doing really well. And I think I'd like to think that that's what people look for when they're looking for a coach.
You're listening to Triathlon Canada's head coach, Jono Hall, sharing around his key insights and philosophies of his coaching career. If you missed last week's episode featuring ex-SAS medical doctor, Dr. Dan Pronk, then it's a must-listen-to episode. Here's a little snippet of what you missed.
I think if you do take the time to sit down and set a decent SMART goal, break it down into little manageable chunks. And one of my favourite sayings in this realm, and it's actually the title of a chapter of the book, is how do you eat an elephant? And the answer's one bite at a time. And so, if you're looking at an elephant, you're thinking about eating it, that's overwhelming. But if you start to break it down just into little bite-sized pieces, any of these big goals start to become accessible and attainable.
To tune into the full episode 146, featuring Dr. Dan Pronk, ex-SAS medical doctor, download the full episode from your favourite podcast player or from within iTunes. For now, let's jump back with Triathlon Canada's head coach, Jono Hall. Jono, outside of the professional elite sporting realm, if you could boil everything you've learnt, this is a very difficult question, down to just one bit of advice to help people tuning in, pursue and perform at their physical best, what would that solitary piece of advice be?
I think when you go to bed at night each day and you look back and you say, I did everything I could today to be the best, and everything I could today might, but on a rest day might mean I was the best at doing nothing today, then that's a great starting point for moving forward. Because at the end of the day, nobody, and I don't care who it is, whether you're a coach, an athlete, a business leader, leading, president of the USA, God forbid, but, at the end of the day, if you can go to bed every day going, yep, I did everything I could today to be better, then you can't do any more than that. And if you can do that often enough, no matter what you're doing, you will build upon that. When you go to bed knowing that you didn't do everything you could do, then you've kind of got no excuse. And so for me, that's something I guess when I talk across sport and I talk generically, and whether it's talking with youngsters or business people, and especially my athletes, it's that point, and that's what I do. That's what I try to do. When I go to bed, I think, did I get everything out of the day that I planned to do? And I don't set ridiculous targets. And if I don't, then I'm pretty hard on myself about making sure I do. But what I found is there's a correlation. When you take that approach and you do that and you reflect on it, it's a pretty happy place to be, and it gains momentum and then it builds from there.
Awesome. Jono, fun question. If you could have dinner with three people, this is what we call the personality question, the personality behind the featured guest. Three people at a dinner table, living or past, excluding your family. Who's at your table and why?
This is a really, really tough one. I would love to have Barack Obama at my table. I found him, I'm not from political particular, I just found him to be an incredible orator. His connection when he spoke with people. As a coach, I see a person speaking and I see people listening. He was someone who I just love to be in his presence and kind of, at that level, up close to see what it really is that he brings to the table and why people listen. I'm a huge Motorhead fan. So Lemmy Kilmister, who was the lead singer of Motorhead, is someone who, again, he put himself at the very pointy end of what he did. He was very good at what he did, but he did it in a way that was actually self-detrimental. I mean, there was a lot of, and you see with a lot of these famous musicians, there's alcohol or drugs, or there's something involved. I'd love to sit and listen to someone like that and reflect on what they did well and what they didn't do well, because I think we all focus on what we do well and we're not always aware of the pitfalls of what can come of that, especially around success. I think people underestimate the negative side of being successful. And so he's a guy who who I respect, who I love his music, and he's got an interesting story. He's someone I could learn from, and he's a character. I mean, it would be over probably, 5 bottles of JD or something ridiculous, but he would bring something to me that would enrich or deepen my understanding of being successful, but what's on the flip side of being successful. Third person, it's a really tough one. I'm not going to split it here. I'd like to have Craig Mottram sharing a seat with Drew Ginn from rowing. So Craig Mottram is obviously an Australian distance runner. For my mind, outside of Steve Monaghetti and Di Castelli, he's been the Australian middle distance runner of our time with his performances. He brings an insight into high performance that every time I listen to him speak about his experiences and how he got there, they're not romantic stories. Behind every good luck story or every good outcome, there's a string of stories behind that paint the reality of how he got there, I guess a little bit like talking about Lemmy. And then Drew Ginn is one of the most – I had the pleasure or the privilege, I should say, to work with Drew before his last Olympics when he was toggling between being a rower or a road cyclist. And while I was working at the Victorian Institute of Sport, I looked after the road cycling piece to get him healthy to go to his next Olympics. And he was just a guy who was a physiological freak. And his intelligence and his intensity and, again, what he brought to the table like I said, having those 3 or 4 people sat in 3 seats around me, if I could do that, once, I'd say I would be 40% better as a coach from what I learnt from that 1 hour session. If I could do it regularly, it gives me goosebumps to think how much better I could be, because they are people who would they're honest, they would share with me their experiences, not just the good. I think a lot of people just share the good and their romantic side, and I think the reality is my experience as an athlete and a coach is that the romantic side is 20% of the entire equation. And understanding both, the good things that come out of why they were good and why they were the best in their field, et cetera, but balanced with what really went on behind the scenes. Because I think that's one thing that, that we don't see that very often. And I know that with Drew and Craig in particular, they're both very willing to be vulnerable. And I think, my experience and the lessons I learned from them was their openness, which again was probably based on trust, to share the whole picture of, who they were, how they got to where they were, what were the good things, what were the challenges. Because I think at the end of the day, the more I'm equipped for, what could go wrong, I'll be better equipped for what needs to go right.
So rich conversation at that table. And Jono, finally here, the physical performance challenge. What's your physical challenge to the listeners of the show going to be for the week?
So my physical challenge is definitely aimed at the runners. One of the things that I've done that I've incorporated, so it certainly wasn't, and it's not a new thing, was and it intrigues people working with athletes who are Olympic level, is we do a lot of run walking. I'd like those who particularly get stuck in that I guess it's a bit of an ego thing, I don't walk. I do my long run, I don't walk, is to challenge yourself and to add walking to your long run program and to add volume. And so a lot of the ways we add volume is by breaking our running, our long runs into run walks. And so if I'm getting my athletes, to run up to 2 hours, that might be a 3-hour session because of what we do walking. And so I'm a big believer in generating endurance through those longer workouts, but I'm also realistic and say a 3-hour, there's none of my guys could complete a 3-hour run. But if I want to get 3 hours of work on their feet, then I've got to incorporate walking. So my challenge is for people to look at their long runs, to break it down into smaller pieces and add some walking in between, and look at ways of increasing their volume, their overall volume on their feet, but in a non-traditional way, not just by running. I think my experience is a lot of people I either run or I stop. And I think there's somewhere in between there. And that's one of the big things. I mean, it's no secret, but it's certainly something that I use a lot. And I'd love to challenge people because I always get it. People are like, well, that's ridiculous, or that's not the way to do it, or, But I know myself, like I can run for 30 minutes if I run. I can probably go out and do 2 hours if I run walk. And there's no question that 2 hours of low intensity volume is much healthier than me than 30 minutes of running. If I run for 35 minutes, I probably won't run for 4 days. And so I think it's just about challenging people's paradigm on how to achieve their volumes and how to achieve their duration by adding walking.
And certainly from a biomechanical point of view, the cumulative loads of walking can add up to be consistent with a shorter run because of the time of impulse, spent on the ground being greater when you walk. So it's actually a very biomechanically sound paradigm shift as well, Jono. Jono, if listeners of the show want to find out a little bit more about what you do, maybe your private group or just your further coaching philosophies, where's the best place that we can find out more?
So social media, I'm sporadically active. If you look me up under the Multisport Brain, and that will be on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. There's a new Instagram page we've just created called Multisport Brain Daily, which is really about, I think what myself and the people who I collaborate with have decided is that we're really interested in sharing knowledge. My coaching group personally is full. It's beautiful not to be in the recruiting game, the sales game of come and spruiking my coaching services so more people come. But what I think it's realised is that it would be great to see a sharing of knowledge, and those sites really set out about. It's not very opinionated. They're really about saying this is what we do and giving people an insight in what we do. And rather than saying this is what I do, the beauty of social media is that you can create short video clips or create some images so that people can actually see what you do. And the idea is just to spruik some curiosity. And one of the things I think we are planning to do in the future is open those channels around for coaches, maybe athletes who want to self-coach, but less so around if you've got questions. I may not be able to coach your athletes, but I'll certainly work with you so that it enhances your ability that you keep your athletes. And so one of the things that really frustrates me is I see a lot of coaches who are good coaches who maybe only have one or two high-level athletes, and then for whatever reason those athletes start to gravitate towards moving around or moving away to another coach. And I'd like to be able to provide those coaches at some stage with an insight or a further insight so that maybe they can keep their athletes for longer and that these athletes don't have to migrate. So it's a little bit of kind of where you can find me, what we're trying to do, and where we're kind of headed in the next piece. But I've kind of got to that stage, I guess, in my career where because people are curious and they're asking, it's not me saying, you know, I've got something to say or I've got something everyone should be looking at, but the people are kind of asking questions and working out why it is the athletes I work with are who they are and why they perform. And so the social media thing is just to give a little bit of an insight, and then it could be the catalyst for asking further questions.
Brilliant. Jono, finally, a few rapid-fire questions. You ready?
Yep.
The most important thing in life is?
Family.
What drives you to work hard?
To be the best I can be.
Where does pressure come from?
Internal and external, but it's self-created.
Are you more externally driven or more internally driven?
Definitely internally driven.
What's the difference between a great coach and a good coach?
I don't think there is a difference. For me, there's no such thing as a great coach or a good coach. You've either got athletes who are performing well or you haven't. And so... yeah, I'm going to leave that one a pass.
Jono, and final two, what mistakes are you afraid of making?
Any.
And lastly, fun question. When Jono Hall, head coach of Triathlon Canada, opens his eyes in the morning...
he looks to see whether Erin is still in bed and heads straight to the coffee machine.
Great. And on that, Jono, obviously it's an exciting time in your family's life with... the recent news of yourself and Erin, who is very rich in the gene pool athletically as well, obviously the bronze medalist from the Olympic triathlon in 2012, expecting a child. So that's great news.
Yeah, very exciting. I think, we've spoken a lot about, I'm 46 years old. I think I'm very, very satisfied with a lot of things I've done in life. I certainly have a lot more to give on the triathlon scene, but I've waited a long time to have a family, and it's something that I've always said, maybe doing it the reverse a little bit, but I've always said this will be the pinnacle, and we're so excited to be starting a family and moving in that direction. And I know that it'll, as we spoke offline, I know it'll make me a better person, it'll make me a better coach, and as everyone knows, I'm gushing like any new father, I guess.
It's so good. Jono, thank you for your time today amongst a very full day and full weeks.
Thanks, mate.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show with Jono Hall, head coach Triathlon Canada, on this Coach's Corner edition. If you enjoyed today's episode, then please let Jono and myself know. You'll find our handles over at the show notes and on social media. You'll find Jono at multisportbrain on Instagram and myself at Brad_beer on Instagram as well. Please be sure to keep the podsies coming. That's a screenshot of the episode that you are enjoying, and tag in myself at Brad_beer on Instagram or the show's handle at Physical Performance Show. It is absolute buzz to see what episode you're enjoying and where it is that you're enjoying it from. Big thanks to the good folks who have been leaving reviews over on iTunes and also hitting subscribe from within your favorite podcast player. Hitting subscribe is the best way to help the Physical Performance Show get into the earbuds of more listeners who, just like yourself, are looking to perform at their physical best. So thank you for hitting subscribe. A big thanks as always to the good folk who make this show possible each week. That's Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Olding on all things graphic design. Of course, another huge thank you to this week's show sponsor, the Gold Coast Marathon. If you're looking for a great event on Australian shores, then do not go past the Gold Coast Marathon, held on the first weekend in July every year. There's an event for everyone, ranging from junior runs right through to the full feature-length marathon. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we jump back over to an expert edition, and I share with you a conversation that I recently had with UK-based strength and conditioning expert and author of Strength and Conditioning for Endurance Runners, Richard Blagrove. If you are curious about all the hype surrounding strength and conditioning work and what it can do for your performance, then you won't want to miss next week's episode. Richard has been the strength and conditioning coach to Olympic athletes. He's an academic at Birmingham City University, and he has a PhD in exercise physiology. So be sure to be tuning in next week to learn all things strength and conditioning. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.